The room smelled of straw, oil, and the faint tang of soda. Cages lined a wooden table. Pigeons cooed and bobbed, pecking at tiny painted targets through glass. Around them stood engineers and psychologists, calculators and sketchbooks on every surface. At the center of the work was B.F. Skinner, the American behaviorist. He did not call it poetry. He called it operant conditioning, the science of shaping behavior by reinforcement. Skinner believed pigeons could learn to do more than carry messages. They could see, recognize, and steer. The idea was startlingly simple and strangely elegant. A small optical projector would throw an image of the target onto a screen inside the nose cone of a glide bomb. One or more pigeons, trained to peck at that specific image, would keep the projected target centered by pecking. Their beak movements would be translated into electrical or mechanical signals to adjust the bomb's control surfaces. The bird, in effect, would act as a living guidance system. The military took interest. The National Defense Research Committee provided funding to explore the concept. Skinner and his collaborators built prototypes of the nose cone, compartments with viewing ports, sensors, and tiny linkage mechanisms. They trained pigeons to peck at photographs and painted targets, shaping the behavior with food rewards until their pecks were rapid, consistent, and accurate. One documented bird pecked thousands of times in a single trial. Tests were pragmatic and relentless. In controlled setups, pigeons reliably tracked target images even when the picture moved or when distractions were introduced. Engineers recorded the bird's responses. They measured peck rates, reaction times, and the failure modes, when a bird looked away, when two birds disagreed, how to force a majority decision. The system designers planned redundancy, multiple pigeons in separate viewing stations, a voting mechanism to resolve disagreements. Contemporaries called the project eccentric. Yet demonstrations impressed observers. Skinner's pigeons steered simulated payloads toward targets in the lab. The nose cone assemblies were real objects later catalogued by museums. The basic principle worked. Trained animals could correct deviations and keep a glide vehicle on course in test conditions. Still, the experiment existed at the uneasy intersection of biology and engineering. It relied on living creatures under combat conditions, and it competed with rapidly improving electronic guidance systems. By 1944, despite promising demonstrations, the military judged other technologies more immediately practical for wartime deployment. Project Pigeon would be cancelled during the war, only to reappear briefly after it, under the name Project Orcon, as guidance research continued in the late 1940s. What this chapter proved, quietly and irreversibly, was that human ingenuity would look anywhere for an edge, to mathematics, to machinery, and even to the trained eye of a pigeon. The experiment remains one of the most unusual and revealing footnotes of wartime innovation, a reminder that wartime necessity pushed scientists to fuse behavior and mechanics in ways few had imagined. In the dim light of a Cambridge laboratory, pigeons pecked at small illuminated targets while a mechanical clicker marked every correct response. Each successful peck triggered a pellet of food, reinforcing the behavior. B.F. Skinner, clipboard in hand, observed silently, noting which birds learned fastest and which struggled. The process was painstaking, weeks of conditioning for each bird, repetition until the pecks became instinctual. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic in Minneapolis, engineers were building the physical mechanisms for the guidance system. Nose cones with viewing ports were assembled with precision instruments, tiny linkages, mechanical levers, and potentiometers connected to the bird's perch. The idea was that as a pigeon pecked at the projected target, the movement would translate into real-time adjustments of the bomb's flight path. Observers marveled at the blend of psychology and engineering. One technician noted, "The bird doesn't know it's guiding a weapon. It sees only the dot, the light, yet that behavior, perfectly shaped, could steer destruction miles away." It was the first demonstration of biological computation applied to warfare. Training the pigeons was not just about accuracy. The birds had to ignore distractions, passing shadows, noise, and multiple targets. Only those who reliably tracked a single moving image were selected for the next phase. Multiple pigeons would later be installed per nose cone, allowing majority voting to determine adjustments, ensuring reliability in case one bird faltered. By late 1943, prototypes were functioning. Pigeons pecked with such precision that engineers began plotting flight simulations. The experiments revealed surprising insights. Birds could sustain attention far longer than expected, could differentiate subtle visual contrasts, and could respond faster than some of the early mechanical senses. Yet skepticism remained. Military officers questioned whether living animals could survive the rigors of flight at high speeds or in combat conditions. Nevertheless, the combination of rigorous conditioning and mechanical ingenuity marked a bold step toward unconventional warfare technology, a fusion of mind, biology, and machine unseen before in military history. In a secluded test range outside the English countryside, the first pigeon-guided bombs were mounted on small-scale prototype rockets. Engineers and psychologists gathered behind sandbags and observation towers, recording every movement. The sky was gray, clouds pressing low, as if nature itself anticipated the unusual experiment. Each nose cone held a single trained pigeon, staring intently at the tiny moving target projected inside its compartment. As the rocket soared along a short track, the bird pecked at the light, sending signals through the mechanical linkages that adjusted the fins. On the control monitors, slight deviations corrected automatically, translating instinctual pecks into navigational precision. Lieutenant Colonel Clarence L. Skip Johnson, supervising the trials, noted the unprecedented focus of the pigeons. Some of these birds, when conditioned properly, tracked the target almost as if they understood the stakes, he remarked. Engineers measured lateral displacement, response time, and accuracy, jotting down observations in thick notebooks. Early failures were frequent. Pigeons occasionally froze or misinterpreted moving shadows, sending the rocket off course. But repeated trials refined both the training methods and the mechanical interface. By the summer of 1944, a small number of prototypes achieved a level of accuracy that impressed both scientists and military observers. Photographs captured these early tests: a small, darting missile on a makeshift launch rail, sandbags surrounding the observation team, pigeons peering through the tiny viewports. While the concept was bizarre, the results were tangible. The integration of living behavior into guided technology was no longer theoretical, it was becoming operationally feasible. Despite the success in controlled conditions, questions loomed. Could this system be scaled for full-size ordnance? Could pigeons survive high-speed launches and turbulent atmospheric conditions? Yet the experimental trials demonstrated a radical principle. Biology could be harnessed for precision, and intuition, not just mechanics, could guide weapons of war. Mid-1940s. A bare concrete hangar. Test rigs lined one side, plywood nose cones another. Men in uniform watched through binoculars. Engineers scribbled notes. Pigeons pecked at tiny moving images behind glass. B.F. Skinner's demonstrations impressed the observers. The birds were reliable in controlled conditions. 3 pigeons, wired to a simple voting mechanism, could keep a projected target centered. The mechanism translated pecks into mechanical corrections. In lab trials, the system worked. It steered. It hit simulated targets. But the military did not make decisions in laboratories alone. They asked practical questions, blunt, unforgiving questions of war. Could a living creature survive the G-forces of launch? Could it keep focus in the chaos of combat? Could maintenance and training scale across thousands of weapons? How would pigeons perform in bad weather, in smoke, under flak? Officials from ordnance bureaus and the National Defense Research Committee inspected prototypes. They saw promise. They saw novelty. They also saw limits. Electronic guidance systems were advancing rapidly. Radar, radio control, and emerging electro-optical devices offered solutions that did not rely on feeding, housing, and training animals. Reliability could be engineered without biology's variability. Practical trials exposed more problems. Some birds lost focus when vibrations changed. Some reacted to shadows or flocks of wild birds. The redundancy plans, multiple birds per nose cone, reduced single-point failures but added complexity and weight. Logistics loomed large: kennels, trainers, transport, replacement birds for combat losses. The human cost of managing living components inside weapons began to look less like innovation and more like a logistical burden. Still, the project moved forward for a time. Military funders continued support long enough to refine prototypes and record data. The Navy later catalogued the work under related research programs. But momentum shifted. By war's end, electronic and mechanical guidance systems had matured faster than many expected. Television-guided bombs, radar homing, and radio control offered paths that fit industrial production and wartime urgency. The Pigeon guidance concept survived briefly after the war in limited research programs, a testament to scientific curiosity more than tactical priority. Ultimately, practicality won. The idea that a trained bird could serve as an onboard guidance subsystem proved correct in principle. It proved unworkable at scale and in the messy realities of combat. The military's verdict was not a dismissal of ingenuity. It was an exercise in cold calculus, which technologies could be produced, maintained, and deployed reliably in the numbers the war demanded. In that balance, the living guidance system, extraordinary, elegant, and unsettling, yielded to metal, wire, and vacuum tubes. October 1944. Washington, D.C. The research files of Project Pigeon were stacked neatly on a long oak table inside the National Defense Research Committee's offices. A short memo summarized the final verdict in calm, bureaucratic language: further development not warranted at this time. B. F. Skinner received the news in his lab at the University of Minnesota. The war had shifted. Radar-controlled bombs, proximity fuses, and early television-guided munitions were now taking shape. Engineers were replacing wings and feathers with circuits and vacuum tubes. The world was learning how to make machines see. Skinner's disappointment was profound but controlled, like the man himself. He wrote later in his notes, "We had achieved control. Reliable, reproducible control. But not in a form that men of war could accept." The irony stung, that his birds, with minds the size of a walnut, had accomplished what electronics still struggled to do. The crates containing the test equipment were sealed and labeled obsolete. Pigeons once destined for combat were released back into their lofts or quietly reassigned to research facilities. A few were kept as curiosities, their names, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, painted faintly on the wooden boxes that once carried them. The U.S. military moved on quickly. But within small circles of behavioral scientists, the experiment became a legend, a strange fusion of psychology and warfare, of intelligence both organic and mechanical. Skinner's students would later say the project changed the way he thought about the boundary between behavior and technology. Years later, when Skinner revisited his wartime journals, he wrote, "The failure of Project Pigeon was not in the birds. It was in our imagination. We were not yet ready to see intelligence without a human face." By the end of the decade, the newly formed RAND Corporation and other defense think tanks were exploring automated control systems, electronic brains that mimicked, in mathematical form, what Skinner's pigeons had done by instinct. The lineage was indirect but real. Behavioral feedback, the core of the Pigeon system, became the logic behind cybernetics. So while Project Pigeon was cancelled, its ideas took flight in other forms. Control theory, feedback loops, signal correction, all principles that underpinned the guidance of later missiles, drones, and smart weapons, were descendants of those wartime experiments. What began as an eccentric wartime footnote was, in truth, an evolutionary step. A moment when the line between biology and machine blurred for the first time, and the world began to imagine weapons that could think for themselves. A small research lab in Princeton, New Jersey. The war was over, but a new one, colder, quieter, had begun. The Korean conflict and the race for nuclear superiority revived an old idea deep in the archives of American defense research. The file was marked simply, Project Pigeon, Confidential. The Navy, now facing new Soviet threats, reopened the folder under a new name, Project Orcon, short for Organic Control. It was the same concept, but with improved materials, better optics, and a hint of desperation. Radar could jam. radio guidance could fail. But living navigation, that could adapt, learn, and react, still fascinated the military's top minds. Once again, pigeons were trained in darkened labs under Skinner's supervision. The setup looked almost identical to the wartime version: 3 birds in separate compartments, pecking at screens that displayed blurred silhouettes of enemy ships or bridges. Each peck triggered a mechanical relay, steering a mock bomb toward the center of its target. But now the technology was more refined. The pigeons sat behind newly developed lucite windows. Cameras and gyroscopes translated their movements into real-time corrections. The system's precision astonished observers, within inches of accuracy in repeated tests. One Navy officer was heard saying, "They are better than our instruments." Still, skepticism ran deep. The military brass, now enamored with electronics and jet-age engineering, viewed the idea as a relic of wartime improvisation. Behavioral science was not yet the language of power. Machines, not animals, were the future. In July 1953, after months of trials, the Navy terminated Project Orcon. The final report concluded, while technically feasible, the system is operationally impractical due to training complexity and logistical limitations. The remaining pigeons were released, some said ceremoniously, others quietly, without a word. Skinner, standing by the lab window, watched them vanish into the summer sky. He later remarked to a colleague, half smiling, "Perhaps the only truly free pigeons are the ones that failed the experiment." But even in failure, Orcon had proven something extraordinary. It showed that learning, biological or artificial, could control complex machines. It was the first bridge between organic behavior and automated guidance. Years later, the same principles would reappear, not in feathers and beaks, but in neural networks and AI feedback systems. In that sense, Project Orcon didn't die. It evolved. The pigeons were gone, but their logic remained, fluttering silently inside the circuits of the future. A new age dawned. The space race had begun, and the word cybernetics was spreading through every military lab in the Western world. What once seemed absurd, the idea that living creatures could guide machines, now evolved into something far more abstract and infinitely more powerful. At MIT's Lincoln Laboratory, the first digital feedback systems were being tested. Instead of pigeons pecking at moving images, vacuum tubes and transistors calculated the difference between a missile's path and its target. The principle was the same: detect an error, correct the trajectory, repeat, but this time, no wings were required. What Skinner had done with birds, scientists like Norbert Wiener, the father of cybernetics, now did with equations. In one of his papers, Wiener even referenced biological guidance as a precursor to mechanical intelligence, an indirect nod to the strange wartime project that bridged psychology and engineering. Across the Atlantic, British researchers at Farnborough and Malvern were developing the Blue Steel missile, a nuclear-capable air-to-surface weapon guided by gyroscopes and early analog computers. They studied behavior patterns, feedback, and self-correction, the same principles that had once trained pigeons to recognize ships. The connection wasn't lost on them. One British engineer later wrote in his private notes, "Skinner's birds were not foolish, they were a prophecy. Replace the brain with a circuit, and you have the same intelligence." By the early 1960s, that prophecy had come true. The US developed the AGM-45 Shrike, followed by the AGM-65 Maverick, both using optical and radar homing systems based on feedback loops, the mechanical equivalent of learned response. It was a strange evolution. What began in dim rooms with cooing pigeons and mechanical levers had transformed into silicon, guidance chips, and computational learning. The principles remained identical: observe, compare, correct, and repeat until accuracy is achieved. Every smart weapon of the modern era, from laser-guided bombs to autonomous drones, owes a sliver of its logic to that unlikely beginning. The ghost of Project Pigeon lived on, hidden inside circuits and code. As one Cold War scientist famously put it, "Machines learned to think the moment we realized birds already could." For decades, Project Pigeon remained buried in classified archives, its files gathering dust in the National Museum of American History. Few knew it had ever existed. Military historians dismissed it as a curious footnote, a strange psychological experiment from a desperate wartime era. But in the late 1970s, a young researcher named Dr. N. Ulrich, working at the Smithsonian, stumbled across a set of old film reels labeled Behavioral Guidance, Skinner, 1943. Inside the tin cans were grainy black and white recordings, pigeons tapping screens, miniature bomb casings, and Skinner's calm voice explaining how reinforcement could shape flight control. The discovery shocked the academic world. Ulrich published an article titled The Birds Who Almost Went to War in Scientific American, sparking a wave of renewed interest in wartime behavioral science. For the first time, the public saw how far the Allies had been willing to go to outthink their enemies, not with brute force, but with creativity. Within months, Project Pigeon became a subject of documentaries and university lectures. At Harvard, psychology students analyzed Skinner's training methods as examples of adaptive behavior under operant conditioning. At the Royal Air Force Museum in London, engineers compared Skinner's early mechanical design to post-war missile guidance systems. Even the U.S. military took notice. Declassified reports acknowledged that although the project was never operational, its core principles, real-time feedback and adaptive targeting, directly influenced post-war research into electronic guidance and early computing. Yet, beyond the scientific recognition, there was something deeply human about its rediscovery. The footage showed not just the machinery, but the quiet interaction between man and bird, Skinner rewarding each successful peck, whispering encouragement as if teaching an ally, not an animal. One clip ends with a pigeon sitting calmly on the device's control plate, tilting its head as if waiting for its next instruction. Skinner's voice, faint under the hiss of old film, says softly, "They don't know they are making history. But they are." That moment, small, humble, almost absurd, captured what Project Pigeon truly represented: the boundless imagination of wartime science and the belief that even the smallest creatures could help guide humanity through its darkest hour. By the 1950s, radar-guided missiles and analog computers had replaced the need for trained pigeons, but the principles born from Project Pigeon never died. What Skinner proved, and what military engineers later embraced, was that feedback systems could learn, adapt, and correct themselves in real time. Across the Atlantic, at Britain's Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, engineers began experimenting with proportional navigation, a concept eerily similar to Skinner's vision, guiding a missile not toward where a target was, but where it would be. Meanwhile, in the United States, companies like Bell Labs and Raytheon incorporated behavioral prediction models into their early guidance computers, translating biological responses into electrical logic. Even NASA engineers studying autonomous spacecraft navigation cited Skinner's pigeon-controlled bombs as a historical curiosity, a primitive but visionary form of machine learning. In 1960, when the U.S. Navy tested the first heat-seeking Sidewinder missile, its targeting system was described in technical reports as a responsive feedback loop sensitive to moving stimuli. In other words, a pigeon, reborn in silicon. Psychologists, too, drew lessons from the project. Skinner's demonstration that animals could adapt complex motor tasks under continuous reinforcement laid groundwork for modern behaviorism and early AI training algorithms. When computer scientists in the 1980s began to talk about neural networks, many quietly acknowledged the lineage: pigeons pecking at screens, teaching humanity how feedback could guide intelligence. In a twist of irony, the project once mocked as absurd, birds steering bombs, turned out to foreshadow technologies that now guide everything from missiles to Mars rovers. What was once instinct and reward became data and code. And in that evolution, the humble pigeon, dismissed by generals, forgotten by history, became one of the first teachers of the modern machine mind. Although the pigeon projects were never implemented in combat, their impact on the development of navigation technology was enormous. What began as an almost absurd idea, to teach a bird to control a missile, actually laid the foundation for the creation of future smart guidance systems. After the end of World War II, American and British scientists began to look for other ways to achieve the same goal, to make weapons self-guided. And it was during the analysis of the results of Project Pigeon that researchers realized behavioral training could be replaced by mathematical algorithms. Thus began work on the first electronic image analysis, optical pattern recognition, and the basic elements of artificial intelligence. In the 1950s and 1960s, when the first digital computers began to appear, the ideas that once underpinned the Pigeon project were revived in a new form. American engineers developed guidance systems for AGM-65 Maverick missiles, the British improved systems for anti-ship sea skewer. The principle remained the same: target analysis, comparison with the standard, course correction. Only instead of a bird, a processor sat at the remote control. Some historians of technology believe that it was thanks to such experiments that science made the leap from biological to electronic intelligence. What seemed like a curiosity in the 1940s has today become the foundation for missiles with laser, infrared, and GPS guidance. The Museum of American History in Washington keeps a model of a missile in which it was once planned to place 3 pigeons. Next to it is a plaque with the inscription, "Sometimes progress begins with a strange idea, sometimes progress begins with a strange idea." And indeed, less than a century has passed from the wings of a pigeon to artificial intelligence. But it was these strange, at first glance, experiments that showed humanity that even the most humble creatures can inspire the creation of technologies that change the history of war and science itself.